On the night of May 26, 1911, 1 million electric light bulbs blazed across 10 acres of wooden towers, gilded domes, and fantastical attractions rising from the Brooklyn shoreline. This was Dreamland, the most ambitious amusement park ever built in America. It had taken $3.5 million and 2,000 men working around the clock to construct. In just a few hours, it would all be gone. But this story is not just about a fire. It is about the man who built Dreamland, a Brooklyn real estate speculator named William Reynolds, who became a state senator at 24 and dreamed of creating a white city by the sea. It is about the 300 little people who lived in a miniature German village inside the park. It is about a doctor who saved thousands of premature babies in glass boxes, while the medical establishment called him a fraud. And it is about a one-armed lion tamer and the beast that would escape into the streets of Brooklyn with its mane on fire. If you find yourself returning to my channel for real stories like these, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us continue this work. Now, let us begin on that final night, in the darkness beneath a ride called Hell Gate. Chapter 1. A Bucket of Hot Tar. The entrance to Hell Gate was impossible to miss. A massive red figure of Satan loomed over the building, bat wings spread across the entire facade, glowering down at the crowds below. During operating hours, ticket sellers in red robes and horned hats collected 10 cents from each visitor before they climbed into open boats and descended into a 50-foot whirlpool. The water swirled in ever-narrowing circles until the boats vanished, seemingly swallowed into the bowels of the earth. Beneath the surface, passengers floated through dark tunnels lined with papier-mâché demons and tongues of red paper fire. Satan himself sat on a rock, rubbing his hands with glee as mechanical sinners were dragged into pits of gray steam. The ride ended with a monotonous sermon on good behavior, delivered by a man who, according to one visitor, did not seem to believe a word he was told to preach. But on the night of May 26, 1911, there were no visitors. Dreamland had closed shortly after midnight, and the streets of Coney Island were nearly deserted by 2 a.m. Inside Hell Gate, a crew from Samuel Engelstein's roofing company was working through the night. A leak in the tunnel ceiling needed to be sealed before the park's official opening the next day. It was Memorial Day weekend, the busiest days of the entire season. The men worked by the glow of electric light bulbs strung along the scaffolding. Buckets of hot tar sat nearby, the pitch heated to a workable consistency for caulking the leak. It was tedious work, made more urgent by the knowledge that thousands of visitors would be descending into these tunnels in just a few hours. At approximately 1:30 a.m, the lights began to flicker. Then they exploded. The bulbs burst one after another, showering the workers with glass and plunging the tunnel into absolute darkness. In the confusion, someone stumbled. A boot connected with a bucket. Hot pitch spilled across the wooden floor and ignited. In the seconds that followed, the workers had a choice. They could fight the flames themselves, or they could run for help. The manager of the repair crew chose to fight. It was a decision that would cost Dreamland everything. The fire fed on the pitch-soaked wood and raced up the scaffolding. Hell Gate's structure, like nearly every building in Dreamland, was built from lath, thin strips of wood covered with staff, a moldable mixture of plight of Paris and hemp fiber. It was cheap. It was fast to construct, and it burned like kindling. By the time a frightened night watchman reached the fire alarm box, flames were already licking at the ceiling. He pressed the key 3 times in rapid succession, sending 3 alarms out into the Brooklyn night. 20 minutes later, all 10 acres of Dreamland were ablaze. The fire moved with terrifying speed. Winds from the Atlantic pushed the flames from building to building, leaping across the narrow pathways that separated the attractions. The Great Beacon Tower, wrapped in 100,000 electric bulbs, became a pillar of fire visible for 15 miles. Inside the shooting galleries, tens of thousands of ammunition cartridges began to explode, the sound echoing across Coney Island like a battlefield. One witness said the inferno sounded like a volcano erupting. The lagoon at the center of the park, where boats had once drifted past Roman columns and Venetian palaces, began to boil. Coney Island had prepared for this moment. A high-pressure water system had been installed specifically to protect against fire, the most feared enemy of any amusement district built from wood and plaster. The system was supposed to deliver water at 125 pounds of pressure. But as Dreamland burned, the pressure gauges read barely 20 pounds. Neighboring properties, seeing the inferno spreading toward them, had tapped into the same water mains to hose down their own buildings. There was simply not enough water to go around. Fire companies raced toward Coney Island from across Brooklyn, some from as far as 8 miles away. Horses had to rest during the journey. By the time reinforcements arrived, both on land and from fireboats pumping water from the ocean, it was clear that Dreamland was beyond saving. The firefighters turned their attention to protecting everything around it. Inside the park, 200 employees who had been sleeping in their quarters scrambled to escape. Night watchmen and police officers ran through the streets, pounding on doors and shouting for people to evacuate. But not everyone in Dreamland that night was human. Near the eastern edge of the park, several hundred yards from where Hellgate still burned, over 80 wild animals paced in their cages. Lions, leopards, bears, wolves, hyenas, pumas, a baby elephant named Little Hip, and among the big cats, a 3-year-old Nubian lion with a black mane. His name was Black Prince, and in less than an hour he would be running through the streets of Brooklyn, his mane on fire, with police officers in pursuit. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Became Senator. William Henry Reynolds was born on the 29th of February, 1868, in Brooklyn, New York. It was a leap year, which meant he would only have a proper birthday once every 4 years. Perhaps that explained something about the man he became. He seemed to live 4 lives in the time most men lived one. His father, also named William, worked as a builder and carpenter. His mother was Margaret McChesney. The family lived in the Bedford neighborhood, and young William attended Public School 35 on McDonough Street before moving on to Central Grammar School. He was bright enough to be accepted to Harvard, but he never went. He studied law for 2 years at New York University, but he never graduated. William Reynolds was not interested in credentials. He was interested in money. As a boy, he spent his afternoons sweeping up wood shavings in his father's shop. He watched the men work. He watched the bills pile up, and he noticed something that would change his life. His father was a fine builder, but a terrible businessman. He paid his creditors whenever he got around to it, which meant they had to come knocking at the shop to collect, which made them irritable, which made doing business harder than it needed to be. The boy made a proposal. He went to his father's creditors and offered them a deal. If he could guarantee the bills were paid by the 1st of every month, would they accept a 2% discount? The creditors agreed. The father agreed. And young William Reynolds, still a teenager, began collecting 2% on every transaction. It was not much, but it was his. By the time he turned 18, he had saved enough to open his own real estate broker's office on the corner of Reed and Lafayette. This was 1886. Brooklyn was growing fast, and Bedford was becoming one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. Reynolds started buying land and building houses. He built fast. He built cheap. And he sold at prices working families could afford. By the end of his first year in business, he had cleared $40,000 in profit. That would be nearly $1 million today. His father came to work for him. Within a few years, Reynolds had made $500,000 in Bedford alone, but he was already looking for something bigger. In the early 1890s, he turned his attention to a stretch of neglected land bordering Prospect Park. The city of Brooklyn had originally purchased this land through eminent domain to build the park, but when the designers changed the boundaries, the land was no longer needed. The city held a fire sale. Reynolds bought 80 lots. He built row houses on Sterling Place and Park Place and Underhill Avenue. He developed Borough Park, carving 4,000 lots from farmland and selling them to investors while building hundreds of homes himself. He expanded into Bensonhurst and Westminster Heights. He built the Montauk Theater in downtown Brooklyn. He loved musical extravaganzas and eventually added the Casino Theater in Manhattan to his growing collection. And somewhere in the middle of all this building and buying and selling, William Reynolds decided to enter politics. In 1893, at the age of 24, He won the seat for the 3rd District and became the youngest senator in the New York State Senate. He ran as a Republican and was praised as an independent thinker, beholden to no faction or political club. By 1895, he had been appointed chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee. That same year, he stepped away from politics entirely. Reynolds had never wanted to be a career politician. What he wanted was the title. For the rest of his life, he would introduce himself as Senator Reynolds. The word opened doors. It impressed investors. It made men listen. By 1898, Reynolds had more or less finished his work in Prospect Heights. His row houses were sold. His apartment buildings were full. His theaters were profitable. He was rich, respected, and restless. He needed a new challenge. Then, in May of 1903, 2 young men from out west opened an amusement park on Coney Island. Their names were Frederick Thompson and Elmer Dundee. Their park was called Luna Park, and on opening night, 250,000 electric lights blazed to life above the Brooklyn shoreline. 60,000 people flooded through the gates in the first 2 hours. The crowds kept coming all summer. By the 4th of July, just 7 weeks after opening, Thompson and Dundee had paid back every cent they had borrowed to build the place. William Reynolds read the newspapers. He studied the numbers. And he saw, with perfect clarity, what needed to be done. If Luna Park could make that kind of money, imagine what a bigger park could do. A grander park. A park with more lights, more rides, more spectacle than anything the world had ever seen. Reynolds would call it Dreamland. Chapter 3. Building a Dream in 6 Months. In July of 1903, William Reynolds announced his intention to build an amusement park that would rival Luna Park. The newspapers called it the Hippodrome. Reynolds called it an opportunity. He moved fast. Within weeks, he had assembled a group of investors and established the Wonderland Company, capitalized at $1.2 million. The company took title to 15 acres of oceanfront property between Surf Avenue and the Atlantic, stretching from West 5th Street to West 10th. They secured a $200,000 mortgage from the Title Guarantee and Trust Company. And then, Reynolds did something that revealed both his ambition and his connections. He went to Thomas Edison. The Edison Company agreed to manufacture the lights for the new park. It would be, according to one Edison representative, the largest contract for lighting ever made in the United States, and I believe in the world. Reynolds wanted 1 million electric bulbs, 4 times as many as Luna Park. He wanted his park to be visible from ships at sea. Construction began in December of 1903. Reynolds hired the Edward Johnson Company as general contractor and gave them an impossible deadline. The park had to open by May. That gave them less than 6 months to clear the land, demolish the existing buildings, and construct an entire city of towers and lagoons and attractions from nothing. 2,000 workers descended on Coney Island. They worked in 3 shifts, 8 hours each, around the clock. Carpenters, ironworkers, masons, electricians. They laid 90 miles of sewer, water, gas, and electrical conduit beneath the sand. They poured foundations and raised walls and strung wire until their hands bled. Reynolds brought in the Manhattan architectural firm of Kirby, Petit, and Green to design the buildings. He wanted something different from Luna Park, something more refined. Where Luna Park was a riot of color and chaos, Dreamland would be elegant, classical. The buildings would be painted white, with small touches of green and yellow. They would be arranged in harmony around a central lagoon, like a miniature Venice. At the northern end of the lagoon, the workers raised a tower. This was the Beacon Tower, and it would be the heart of Dreamland. Reynolds had seen the Giralda in Seville, Spain, the ancient minaret that had been converted into a cathedral bell tower. He wanted his own version, but bigger. The Giralda stood 340 feet. Reynolds built his tower to 375. The Beacon Tower rose from a base 50 feet square. It cost $100,000 to construct. 2 elevators carried visitors to an observation deck where they could see for 50 miles in every direction, all the way to Manhattan on a clear day. At night, nearly 100,000 electric bulbs outlined its white facade against the darkness. A rotating searchlight swept the sky from its summit. That searchlight caused trouble almost immediately. The Coast Guard complained that its alternating red and white beam too closely resembled the lighthouse at Norton Point. They feared it would lure ships onto the beaches. The city ordered it removed. But the tower itself remained, and it dominated everything. It was one of the tallest structures in the United States in 1904. Taller than anything in New York City. Taller than anything most visitors had ever seen. And every night when those 100,000 bulbs blazed to life, it became a pillar of light visible for miles in every direction. The rest of the park spread out beneath it. A horseshoe-shaped lagoon, 130 feet wide and 300 feet long, with floodgates that allowed salt water to flow in during high tide. A footbridge with ornate columns and carved lions, broad promenades lined with attractions. The buildings were clad in artificial stone, and 1,700 tons of asbestos were packed into the walls for fireproofing. 600,000 gallons of water were stored in the central tower, ready to be released in case of fire. Reynolds thought he had built something permanent, something safe. But beneath the artificial stone and the asbestos, the frames of every building were made of lath, thin strips of wood, covered with staff, a moldable mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber. It was cheap. It was fast. And it was, as one reporter would later note, as flammable as kindling. Reynolds also knew that he was not a showman. He was a builder, a developer, a man who understood money and politics and the value of land. But amusement parks required something else. They required spectacle. They required someone who understood the appetites of crowds. He found that man in Samuel Gumpertz. Gumpertz was born in Washington in 1868, the same year as Reynolds. His father, Herman, was a Civil War veteran and lawyer who moved the family to St. Louis when Samuel was young. When the Montgomery and Queen Circus came to town, 9-year-old Samuel ran away from home to join them. He walked on his hands, he did flip-flops, he worked any job they would give a child. Later, he became an actor at the Tivoli Opera House in San Francisco, playing children's roles, until his voice changed and they demoted him to usher. Humiliated, he fled to Texas and spent 3 years as a cowboy. When Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show came through Abilene, Gumpertz could not resist. He joined as a candy butcher, selling sweets to the crowds, and eventually worked his way into the ring as one of Buffalo Bill's famous Congress of Rough Riders. By his mid-20s, Gumpertz was running theaters and amusement parks in St. Louis. He produced Shakespeare plays. He managed strongmen. He was, briefly, Harry Houdini's first manager. From 1897 to 1903, he operated a chain of 17 theaters for Colonel John D. Hopkins. When Reynolds came calling, Gumpertz brought his circus background to Coney Island. He proposed one of the most unusual attractions the park would ever see. A miniature village where hundreds of little people would live and work and entertain the paying public. He called it Liilipuchia. Reynolds approved. He approved of everything that might draw crowds and separate them from their money. He approved of the animal arena that Frank Bostock, the famous animal trainer, agreed to operate. He approved of the baby incubators that a German doctor named Martin County wanted to install. He approved of rides and shows and spectacles of every description. By January of 1904, the park had a name. They called it Dreamland. The electricity alone would cost $4,000 a week to run. The tower cost $100 a night to illuminate. Reynolds had already spent $3.5 million, 5 times what Thompson and Dundee had spent on Luna Park. But he was confident. Luna Park had paid back its construction loans in 7 weeks. Dreamland would do even better. Now all he had to do was open the gates. Chapter 4. A Million Lights. The most spectacular way to arrive at Dreamland was by water. Every hour, steamboats departed from terminals at the Battery, 23rd Street, and Harlem in Manhattan. The ride cost 35 cents, which included admission to the park. Passengers crowded the rails as the boat rounded the point and Coney Island came into view. First they saw the beach, then the jumble of hotels and bathhouses along the shore, and then, rising above everything else, the White Tower. The beacon tower was visible from miles away, even in daylight, but it was at dusk that the real show began. As the sun dropped below the horizon, the tower began to glow. First, a few lights flickered on near the base, then more, climbing higher, spreading outward in ribbons and streams until the entire structure blazed against the darkening sky. 100,000 bulbs, pure white, turning the tower into a pillar of fire that could be seen from ships at sea, and the tower was only the beginning. 1,000,000 electric lights outlined the rooftops and facades of Dreamland. They traced the curves of domes and the edges of spires. They reflected off the lagoon in shimmering sheets. When visitors stepped off the steamboat and onto the pier, they found themselves surrounded by light. It poured from every direction. It turned night into something that felt like a dream. The pier itself stretched nearly 2,000 feet into the Atlantic. Its steel structure rose 2 stories high, with broad walkways that could accommodate thousands of visitors at once. On the upper deck at the very end of the pier stood the Dreamland Ballroom. It was the largest ballroom in New York State. 25,000 square feet of polished floor, 100 feet wide and 250 feet long, with a ceiling that soared 50 feet overhead. 10,000 electric lights hung from that ceiling, bathing the dancers in soft, golden light. Windows on 3 sides offered views of the ocean by day and reflections of the illuminated park by night. A seashell canopy arched over the orchestra pit, where musicians played waltzes and ragtime until the early hours of the morning. The ballroom could hold 4,000 couples at once, and on busy summer nights it did. Adjoining the ballroom was a restaurant nearly as large, serving cuisine that rivaled the finest establishments in Manhattan. Below, on the pier's lower deck, 1,200 bath lockers allowed visitors to change into the long woolen bathing suits that modesty required. There was also a replica of Manhattan's Bowery, complete with Chinese shops and attractions where, as one newspaper delicately put it, the lid would be off. But the pier was only one corner of Dreamland. The rest of the park spread inland from the water, arranged around the Horseshoe Lagoon with its floodgates and footbridges and carved stone lions. Broad promenades lined with white buildings stretched in every direction. The park could hold 100,000 visitors at once, and on the busiest days, it needed every inch of that capacity. Reynolds had spent $3.5 million, but he had built something that employed 14,000 people at a weekly payroll of $85,000. He had built a city. On the morning of May 15, 1904, the gates opened 3 hours behind schedule. The weather was not kind. A thick fog hung over Coney Island, and the air was cold for May. But 135,000 people came anyway. They paid 10 cents on weekdays, 15 cents on weekends, just to walk through the gates. Individual rides cost extra, up to 25 cents for the best attractions. The steamboat passengers had it easier, their admission included in the ticket price. But however they arrived, they all wanted the same thing. They wanted to see what $3.5 million looked like. The main entrance on Surf Avenue stood 150 feet deep, 50 feet wide, and 75 feet high. It was designed to announce that this was not some ordinary amusement park. This was Dreamland. The entrance featured a massive allegorical figure representing education, a woman reaching toward the sky. The message was clear. Reynolds wanted visitors to believe they were entering a place of refinement and improvement, not merely entertainment. Inside, pretty young women in long white gowns and pale blue mortarboard caps sat in the ticket booths. They looked like college graduates, which was precisely the point. Everything about Dreamland was meant to signal class and respectability. The buildings were painted white, like the famous White City of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The architecture was classical and harmonious, designed by professionals, not the chaotic jumble of styles that defined Luna Park across the street. But on that first day, many of the attractions were still unfinished. The tower's observation deck was not yet open. Several rides were still under construction. Visitors wandered the white promenades and marveled at what was complete, but Reynolds knew he was showing them an unfinished canvas. The ballroom, at least, was ready, and by that first evening, despite the cold and the fog, it was packed. The orchestra played, couples danced, everyone agreed it was the finest ballroom on Coney Island. Midget City received glowing reviews. So did Bostock's Animal Arena and the Fighting the Flames spectacle, where 2,000 performers reenacted a massive hotel fire, complete with real flames, real water, and real firefighters, making daring rescues from a 6-story building. The show was twice as large as Luna Park's version, with 4 times as many firefighters and a building 2 stories taller. By Memorial Day, most of the remaining attractions were open, and by the end of that first season, Reynolds announced that Dreamland had recorded a net profit of $400,000. It sounded like a triumph. But Reynolds knew the truth. Luna Park, with its cheaper construction and lower overhead, was making more money. Steeplechase Park, with its emphasis on pure fun over education, was drawing bigger crowds. Dreamland was beautiful. Dreamland was impressive. But the largely working-class visitors who flocked to Coney Island did not want refinement. They wanted chaos and noise and exotic thrills. Dreamland's cultural pretensions were lost on them. Reynolds would spend the next 7 years trying to fix that problem. He would add new attractions every season. He would pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into improvements. He would eventually abandon the all-white color scheme and repaint the buildings in cream and red. He would even hire Samuel Gumpertz, the circus man, to take over as general manager. But nothing would ever quite close the gap. Dreamland would always be the park that tried too hard to be respectable, in a place where respectability was the last thing anyone wanted. Still, every night, the lights came on. 1 million bulbs blazing against the darkness. Visitors would stand on the beach or on the decks of approaching steamboats and watch the tower ignite. For a few hours, it was possible to believe that William Reynolds had built something magical. And in a way, he had. Chapter 5. Shoot the Chutes and Leapfrog. The rides at Dreamland were designed to do one thing: make visitors scream. At the foot of the lagoon, near the Beacon Tower, stood the most popular attraction in the park. Shoot the Chutes was a water ride, simple in concept, but thrilling in execution. 2 parallel ramps stretched out over the beach and into the ocean, rising 96 feet into the air. Each ramp ran 316 feet from top to bottom. Flat-bottomed boats, each carrying a dozen passengers, climbed slowly to the summit on a mechanical lift. Then gravity took over. The boats plunged down the wooden ramps at terrifying speed, passengers clutching the rails and each other, wind tearing at their clothes and hair. At the bottom, the boats hit the lagoon with an enormous splash that soaked everyone aboard and sent sheets of spray into the faces of spectators watching from the bridge. Then the boats glided across the water to the landing, where the drenched and laughing passengers stumbled off to make room for the next group. Luna Park had 1 Shoot the Chutes. Dreamland had 2 running side by side. The double-barrel design meant the ride could handle 7,000 passengers every hour. On hot summer days, the line stretched across the promenade, but it moved fast, and nobody seemed to mind getting wet. If Shoot the Chutes was Dreamland's most popular thrill, the Leapfrog Railway was its most peculiar. The ride sat on its own pier, extending out over the water on 400 feet of track that led seemingly to nowhere. 2 squat enclosed rail cars faced each other at opposite ends of the line. Each car held 32 passengers, packed tight on wooden benches. When the attendants gave the signal, both cars lurched forward, picking up speed as they hurtled toward each other on the same track. Passengers gripped their seats. Children screamed. The cars rushed closer and closer, a collision seemingly inevitable. And then, at the last possible moment, one car climbed over the other. The lower car ducked down while the upper car rolled along rails mounted on its roof, passengers staring down at the passengers below, everyone waving and shrieking as the impossible maneuver completed itself. The cars continued to their opposite terminals, where they turned around and did it all again, this time switching positions. It was based on a patent issued in 1895 to an inventor named Henry Latimer Simmons. Whether anyone ever found a practical use for the technology is unclear. But at Dreamland, it did not need to be practical. It only needed to be terrifying. And it was. For visitors who preferred their thrills with a touch of romance, there was the Canals of Venice. The building that housed this attraction was Dreamland's most beautiful, 250 feet long and 80 feet wide, designed to look like the Doge's palace in Venice. Inside, visitors boarded gondolas that floated through a miniature reproduction of the Italian city, complete with arched bridges, flickering lanterns, and facades painted to resemble the buildings along the Grand Canal. The water was calm. The lighting was dim. Couples leaned close together in the narrow boats, while gondoliers in striped shirts poled them through the shadows. It was a copy of Luna Park's old mill ride, but Reynolds had made it grander. The papier-mâché buildings were more detailed. The canal was longer. The atmosphere was more convincing. For a few minutes, visitors could pretend they were somewhere far away from Brooklyn, drifting through a city they would probably never see. Nearby stood Coasting Through Switzerland, a scenic railway that carried passengers through a miniature alpine landscape. The entrance featured a golden proscenium arch 60 feet wide and 30 feet high, designed in the Art Nouveau style. Inside, the cars wound through artificial mountains covered in fake snow. Blasts of cold air hit the passengers as they passed through tunnels, a welcome relief on sweltering August afternoons. It was not as thrilling as the chutes or the leapfrog, but it was beautiful, and it offered something rare at Coney Island, a few minutes of coolness. The following season, Reynolds added an attraction that would become one of Dreamland's most famous. He had seen it at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair and paid $250,000 to bring it to Coney Island. It was called Creation. The entrance on Surf Avenue was impossible to miss. A 40-foot female figure, bare-breasted and winged, spread her arms in welcome above the doorway. In that era of buttoned collars and covered ankles, such a display would normally have caused scandal. But the figure was biblical, representing an angel, and so it was deemed acceptable. Inside, visitors boarded boats that carried them backward along a 1,000-foot canal encircling a massive blue dome. Moving panoramas depicted the story of Genesis, from the void before existence through the separation of light and dark, the creation of the heavens and the earth, the emergence of life. The ride climaxed with a vision of paradise itself. It took 20 minutes to complete, and it drew enormous crowds. Creation was part of Reynolds' strategy to make Dreamland respectable. By wrapping entertainment in religious themes, he could attract families who might otherwise avoid the more raucous attractions of Coney Island. The park offered other morality spectacles as well. The end of the world showed the apocalypse in vivid detail, and a show called The Feast of Belshazzar depicted the fall of Babylon. Visitors could sin and repent in the same afternoon, all for the price of a few tickets. But not every attraction at Dreamland pretended to improve the soul. The haunted swing was pure illusion. A dozen passengers sat on a large suspended swing inside a small room furnished with tables, chairs, and pictures on the walls. Attendants started the swing moving gently, then left the room. The swing seemed to gain momentum on its own, swinging higher and higher until passengers found themselves nearly upside down, their stomachs lurching, certain they were about to be thrown from their seats. In fact, the swing barely moved at all. It was the room that rotated around them, furniture bolted to the walls, pictures hanging at impossible angles. The illusion was perfect. Passengers stumbled off the ride dizzy and disoriented, unable to explain what they had experienced. Along the East Promenade, there was a fishing pond where children and adults could try to hook mechanical tin fish with poles and lines. The fish were numbered, and lucky catches won prizes of up to $250. The operator claimed it was a game of skill, though the fish seemed remarkably difficult to catch. There were shooting galleries where marksmen aimed at moving targets. There was an airship ride modeled on the dirigible that Alberto Santos Dumont had flown around the Eiffel Tower, where passengers sat in rocket-shaped gondolas that swung in wide circles from a 150-foot tower. There was a scenic railway called Over the Great Divide that carried passengers through a miniature Rocky Mountain landscape. There was a Japanese cafe, a submarine exhibit, and a show about the destruction of Pompeii. And then there was Hellgate. Reynolds added this attraction in 1905, spending part of the $500,000 he poured into improvements that season. The entrance was designed to unsettle visitors before they even bought a ticket. A huge red figure of Satan, winged and glowering, perched atop the building. Ticket sellers wore red robes and horned hats. The message was clear. You were about to descend into the underworld. Visitors climbed into boats and watched as the craft ahead of them spiraled down a 50-foot whirlpool, disappearing into the water as if swallowed by the earth. When their turn came, they experienced the same vertiginous descent, spinning down and down until they plunged through a curtain of spray and into darkness. The boats floated through caverns lined with plaster stalactites and stalagmites, past flickering lights that suggested flames, through chambers where mechanical demons lurked in the shadows. The ride lasted several minutes, a journey through a theatrical underworld that was equal parts terrifying and absurd. Visitors emerged blinking into the sunlight, relieved to have escaped and already telling their friends they had to try it. Hellgate became one of Dreamland's most popular attractions. But 6 years later, in the darkness of those same tunnels, a bucket of hot tar would tip over and change everything. For now, though, the rides ran day and night. The screams echoed across the promenades, and visitors lined up by the thousands, eager to be thrilled, chilled, and fooled by the mechanical wonders of Dreamland. Chapter 6. The Little People of Liilipuchia. Along the west promenade of Dreamland, past the shooting galleries and the fishing pond, visitors came to a place that stopped them in their tracks. A miniature city rose before them. Half-sized buildings lined cobblestone streets, barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. Gabled rooftops pitched at steep angles. Tavern signs hung from iron brackets. It looked like something from a fairy tale, or from a very old book about Germany. This was Liilipuchia. The newspapers called it Midget City, and 300 little people called it home. Samuel Gumpertz had conceived the idea before Dreamland even opened. He traveled across the country and beyond, visiting World's Fairs and traveling circuses and freak shows, looking for performers no taller than 4 feet. He found them scattered everywhere, working alone or in small groups, often exploited, rarely paid what they were worth. He offered them something different. He offered them a community. The city measured 80 feet wide and 175 feet long, built at half scale as a replica of 15th century Nuremberg. Everything was proportioned to fit its residents. The doorways were 3 feet high. The furniture was sized for people whose feet would otherwise dangle from chairs. The toilets, the stables, even the lifeguard towers on the miniature beach were all built to match the scale of the inhabitants. It was not a prison. It was not a zoo. It was, as the advertisements claimed, an experimental community. The residents of Liilipuchia lived there full-time during the summer season. They had their own parliament, which met to debate the affairs of their tiny nation. They had their own police force. They had their own fire department, which responded every hour to a staged alarm, racing through the streets with miniature equipment to put out a small blaze while crowds of visitors cheered. They had a theater where they performed operas and plays. They had a circus ring where they demonstrated acrobatic feats. They had a laundry staffed by little people dressed as Chinese laundrymen, a joke that the audiences of 1904 found hilarious. They had a livery stable with miniature horses and bantam chickens. They had everything a real town might have, only smaller. And they had visitors. On busy weekend days, as many as 20,000 people paid to walk through Liilipuchia, peering into windows, watching the residents go about their business, marveling at the strangeness of it all. To accentuate the difference in scale, Gumpertz occasionally hired giants to stroll through the village, their heads rising above the rooftops, their shadows falling across entire streets. The arrangement was controversial even then. Some critics called it exploitation, a human zoo where gawkers paid to stare at people whose only crime was being born different. But the residents themselves often saw it differently. Gumpertz paid well, better than most of them had ever earned. He treated them with respect, at least by the standards of the era. And he gave them something rare, a place where they were not the oddity. In Liilipuchia, everyone was the same size. The furniture fit. The doors were the right height. The world, for once, was built for them. Among the most famous residents was Baron Pouchy, billed as the smallest perfect man in the world. He stood just 24 inches tall. He wore tailored suits and derby hats. He drank champagne. He bet on horses at the Coney Island racetrack, and he considered himself, by all accounts, an irresistible ladies' man. Whether the ladies agreed is not recorded. There was Elizabeth, known as the Living Doll, who stood 27 inches and had the face of a porcelain figurine. There was Lady Little, whose stage name told visitors everything they needed to know. There were acrobats and singers and comedians, all of them under 4 feet tall, all of them making their living by being watched. When the park closed for the night, the visitors went home. But the residents of Liilipuchia stayed. They cooked dinner in their half-sized kitchens. They sat in their half-sized parlors. They lived, as much as anyone could, ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. Some of them married each other. Some of them had children who might or might not inherit their parents' stature. The community developed its own rhythms, its own gossip, its own politics. Gumpertz managed Liilipuchia from 1904 to 1906, building it into one of Dreamland's most popular attractions. When the park's owners finally recognized that they needed a showman to run the entire operation, they promoted him to general manager. He never forgot where he started. The sideshow remained close to his heart. By 1911, Liilipuchia had been part of Dreamland for 7 seasons. Its residents had watched the park struggle and adapt, watched the white paint give way to cream and red, watched new attractions come and go. They had become fixtures of Coney Island, as much a part of the place as the Beacon Tower or the Shoot the Chutes. On the night of May 26th, they were asleep in their half-sized beds when the fire began. When the alarm came, it was not a staged hourly drill. It was real. The Liilipuchia Fire Department mobilized alongside the full-sized firefighters, their tiny equipment almost comically inadequate against the inferno spreading from Hellgate. The residents fled into the night, some still in their nightclothes, watching as their miniature city caught fire and burned. They lost everything. The gabled rooftops collapsed. The cobblestone streets cracked from the heat. The furniture, the costumes, the props that had made Liilipuchia feel like a real place, all of it turned to ash. But the residents survived. And when Gumpertz pitched a tent on Surf Avenue the very next day, some of them returned to perform in what he called the Dreamland Circus sideshow. They had lost their city, but they still had their skills. They still had each other. And in the strange economy of Coney Island, there was always someone willing to pay to see them. Chapter 7. The Babies in the Window. Next to the animal arena, Martin County operated an incubator exhibit for premature babies. Cooney was born Michael Cohen in 1869, a German immigrant who claimed to have studied under Pierre Boudin, the French physician credited with pioneering neonatal care. His medical credentials were never verified, but his results were documented. He first demonstrated incubator technology at the Berlin Exposition in 1896, where 6 premature babies survived under his care. He brought the technology to World's Fairs in London, Omaha, and Buffalo before settling permanently in the United States in 1903. Thompson and Dundee gave him space at Luna Park. Reynolds offered him space at Dreamland the following year. Cooney accepted both. The exhibit charged 25 cents admission. Visitors entered a building where rows of glass-fronted incubators held premature infants, some weighing less than 2 pounds. Nurses in white uniforms provided round-the-clock care. Barkers outside called to passers-by. It looked like a sideshow. In many ways, it was one. But behind the spectacle was genuine medical care that hospitals refused to provide. In 1904, the American medical establishment considered premature babies weaklings unlikely to survive. Most hospitals owned no incubators. Those that did rarely used them. The eugenics movement, then at its height, questioned whether saving these infants was even desirable. Cooney disagreed. His operation employed 5 wet nurses who lived on site and fed the babies every 2 hours. He enforced strict rules: no smoking, no alcohol, no foods that might affect the quality of the milk. The incubators used thermostats and filtered air blown past hot water pipes. Each infant cost approximately $15 per day to care for. Cooney never charged the parents. The admission fees covered everything. His own daughter Hildegard was born premature in 1907. She spent her first months in his incubators at Coney Island. She survived. The exhibit drew both crowds and criticism. Child protection groups accused County of exploitation. His defense was simple: these babies would die without him, and the hospitals would not take them. As late as the 1930s, most New York City hospitals still had no dedicated facilities for premature infants. One case became famous. In 1920, a baby named Lucille Horn was born weighing under 2 pounds. Her twin died. Cornell Hospital had 1 incubator, but refused to admit her. Her father brought her to Coney Island. She remained in County's care for 6 months. She lived to be 96 years old. On the night of the fire, nurses evacuated all the babies. Police Sergeant Frederick Klink made several trips into the burning building to help. Early newspaper reports claimed the infants had perished. The reports were wrong. Every baby survived. County moved his operation to Luna Park, where it continued until 1943. That same year, Cornell Hospital opened New York's first dedicated premature infant unit. The hospitals had finally caught up. By then, Cooney had treated more than 8,000 babies. More than 6,500 survived, a rate exceeding 80%. He died in 1950, largely forgotten. Today, every neonatal intensive care unit in the world traces its origins to the work he pioneered at Coney Island. Chapter 8: The One-Armed Lion Tamer. At the northeast corner of Dreamland, Frank Bostock operated the largest wild animal arena in America. Bostock came from a family of English animal showmen dating back to 1805. He was born in 1866 and had toured his trained animals through Paris, London, and across the United States before settling at Coney Island. They called him the Animal King. Under his supervision, a team of trainers performed daily with lions, tigers, bears, leopards, and elephants. The acts ran continuously from morning until night. The star of Bostock's arena was a man who worked with up to 30 lions at once. His name was Captain Jack Bonavita. Bonavita had been born Johann Friedrich Gentner in Philadelphia in 1866. He started as a circus acrobat before discovering his talent for working with big cats. His most famous act was called the armchair. He would sit calmly while 13 lions arranged themselves around him, as if posing for a portrait. On the 31st of July, 1904, Bonavita was training an untrained lion named Baltimore when the animal attacked. 2,000 spectators watched as the lion tore into the trainer's right arm. Bostock himself pulled Bonavita free, but the damage was catastrophic. Infection spread through the wounds. For 8 months, Bonavita resisted amputation. In February of 1905, surgeons removed his right arm entirely. He returned to the arena anyway. The one-armed lion tamer became more famous than ever. Crowds that had once come to see a man work with 30 lions now came to see a man do it with only 1 arm. He performed at Dreamland for 7 seasons. By 1911, Bostock had sold his animal collection to Colonel Joseph Ferrari, but the trainers stayed on. Among the animals was a 3-year-old Nubian lion with a black mane called Black Prince. On the night of the fire, Ferrari and Bonavita rushed to save the animals. Working in darkness lit only by flames, they managed to rescue 5 leopards, 4 lions, and 6 Shetland ponies. But Little Hip, the beloved dwarf elephant who had entertained children for years, refused to move from his concrete block. He died where he stood. Black Prince escaped his cage and fled into the streets with his mane on fire. Police tracked him to a nearby roller coaster called Rocky Road to Dublin and shot him. About 60 animals died that night. Bonavita survived. He went on to work in motion pictures, appearing in films like The Wizard of the Jungle in 1913. But in 1917, while training a polar bear at an animal farm in Los Angeles, the bear attacked and killed him. He had survived more than 50 attacks in his career. He was 50 years old. Chapter 9. The War Between Parks. From 1904 to 1911, 3 amusement parks competed for visitors on Coney Island. Luna Park stood on the north side of Surf Avenue. Dreamland stood directly across the street on the south side. Steeplechase Park operated a few blocks to the east. The rivalry was constant. The parks copied each other relentlessly. When Luna Park installed a scenic railway, Dreamland added one. When Dreamland introduced the Hellgate boat ride, Luna Park responded with new attractions. Every season brought changes designed to outdo the competition. In the summer of 1905, the competition turned ugly. A group of 51 Bontoc people from the Philippines had been exhibited at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. A showman named Truman Hunt, who had served as lieutenant governor of the Bontoc region during the American occupation, brought them to Luna Park for the 1905 season. They were advertised as headhunters and exhibited in a mock village where they performed staged ceremonies for paying crowds. The attraction generated enormous revenue, reportedly $20,000 per week. Hunt forced the Bontoc people to perform dog feasts daily, though in their homeland such ceremonies occurred only on special occasions. The spectacle drew thousands of visitors. Before the season ended, Dreamland offered Hunt more money. He moved the entire village across Surf Avenue to the rival park. Thompson and Dundee, furious at losing their attraction, claimed they had closed the exhibit voluntarily to avoid exploiting the Filipinos. The newspapers did not believe them. The government eventually investigated. Hunt was accused of embezzling over $9,000 in wages. When the Bontoc people were finally sent home in 1906, each received approximately $30 for an entire season's work. Hunt was arrested, but had already squandered the fortune the exhibit had generated. Meanwhile, the financial strain of competition was taking its toll on both major parks. Dreamland opened with $1.9 million in debt, more than the entire cost of building Luna Park. Despite Reynolds' claims of profit, the park struggled. Working-class visitors preferred Luna Park's chaos to Dreamland's elegance. By 1908, Dreamland had abandoned its admission fee on weekdays, charging only for individual attractions. It was a sign of desperation. Luna Park faced its own troubles. In early 1907, Elmer Dundee died unexpectedly. He was 34 years old. Thompson, now sole operator, lacked his partner's business discipline. He spent lavishly on new attractions while revenues declined. By 1912, creditors had taken control of Luna Park. Thompson would die in 1919, bankrupt and largely forgotten. Steeplechase Park burned in 1907 but was quickly rebuilt by its owner, George Tillieu. It would prove the most durable of the 3 parks, operating until 1964. When Dreamland burned in 1911, Reynolds made no attempt to rebuild. He had quietly accumulated a large position in the park's mortgage bonds in the years before the fire. After the destruction, he used his political connections to have New York City purchase the land for $1.8 million, more than its appraised value of $1.5 million. Reynolds profited from the failure he had helped create. Luna Park continued operating after Dreamland's destruction, but it never recaptured the energy of its early years. It burned in 1944 and was not rebuilt. The golden age of Coney Island's amusement parks lasted barely a decade. Of the 3 great parks that defined it, none survived. Chapter 10. The Last Season. By the spring of 1911, Dreamland had never turned a profit. 7 seasons of operation, millions of visitors, and not $1 returned to investors. William Reynolds admitted as much at a tax board meeting in April of that year. The Williamsburg Savings Bank held a $300,000 mortgage on the property, and in 7 years, Dreamland had never paid a single dollar of interest. The park had increased the value of everything around it while generating nothing for its owners. Reynolds no longer cared about saving Dreamland. He had quietly been buying up the park's bonds from other investors at a discount. If the park failed, he would recover more in bankruptcy than he had spent on the bonds. And if the city could be convinced to purchase the land, he would profit handsomely. In a final move, Reynolds gave Samuel Gumpertz complete operating control of the park. On the surface, it looked like an attempt to salvage the enterprise. In reality, Reynolds had turned his attention elsewhere. Gumpertz threw himself into the work. He spent $60,000 on improvements for the 1911 season. The buildings, once painted entirely white, were repainted in cream and firehouse red. He added 30 new shows. A miniature subway circled the park. A new dual-tracked roller coaster rose near the entrance. Joseph Ferrari, a colonel and animal showman, had purchased Frank Bostock's entire collection and would run the wild animal arena. For the first time in years, Dreamland looked alive. The park was scheduled to open for its 8th season on Saturday, May 27, 1911. The Memorial Day weekend crowds would arrive in force. Everything had to be ready. On Friday night, the 26th, workers were making last-minute repairs throughout the park. At the Hell Gate attraction, a boat ride through dim caverns and rushing water, a leak had developed in the trough. A roofing company owned by Samuel Engelstein sent a crew to seal it with hot tar. The men worked by electric light, deep in the tunnels beneath the ride. The tar bubbled in its bucket. The repairs were almost finished. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the lights began to flicker. Then they exploded. The tunnel plunged into darkness. In the confusion, someone kicked over the bucket of hot pitch. Burning tar spread across the wooden floor. Within seconds, the scaffolding was ablaze. The workers scrambled for fire extinguishers. By the time they found them and returned, the flames had reached the rafters. They ran for their lives. James Lillis, the night watchman, saw the orange glow and rushed to the administration building. He shouted one word: fire. The time was 1:58 in the morning. The first alarm went out, then a second, then a third, at 2:06. Fire Chief Edward Rogers ordered his men to connect hoses to the high-pressure hydrants that lined Surf Avenue. Coney Island had invested in a modern fire suppression system specifically to prevent disasters like this. The system was designed to deliver 160 pounds of pressure. When the firemen opened their nozzles, the streams of water arced toward the flames. Then the streams began to fall short. Shorter still. The pressure dropped to 20 pounds. In the first panicked minutes after the fire was spotted, merchants all along Surf Avenue had tapped into the same water system. They were hosing down their own wooden buildings to protect them from flying sparks. The result was catastrophic. There was not enough pressure left to fight the fire itself. Chief Rogers ordered his men to fall back. He called for the fireboats. By now, the wind was carrying the flames in every direction. The buildings of Dreamland were made of lath and staff, thin strips of wood covered with plaster and hemp fiber. They burned like kindling. The shooting galleries exploded as thousands of cartridges ignited in the heat. The sound was compared to a volcano erupting. Dr. Cooney arrived at his incubator building as smoke billowed through the entrance. He and his nurses wrapped 6 premature babies in blankets and carried them into the night. All 6 survived. At the animal arena, Captain Bonavita and Colonel Ferrari worked frantically to free the animals from their cages. They saved 5 leopards, 4 lions, and 6 Shetland ponies. But the fire was moving too fast. 60 of the 150 animals died in their cages, including Little Hip, the dwarf elephant who refused to leave her concrete block. Black Prince, the 3-year-old Nubian lion, escaped with his mane on fire. He fled into the streets and climbed the wooden framework of a roller coaster called the Rocky Road to Dublin. Police surrounded the structure. At 3:25 in the morning, after 24 bullets and a blow from an axe, Black Prince was dead. His body was dragged into the street for display. At 3:03 in the morning, the beacon tower collapsed. The 375-foot structure, once one of the tallest in America, fell inward with a pillar of smoke and flame that rose 1,200 feet into the sky. The tower crashed into the lagoon it had overlooked for 7 years. 100,000 electric bulbs shattered in the fall. By morning, Dreamland was gone. The fire had swept everything from West 5th Street to West 10th Street, from Surf Avenue to the ocean. 200 buildings destroyed, the pier swept clean to its steel foundations. The damage was estimated between $2 and $3 million. The park was insured for less than $500,000. Reynolds received the news at his home in Long Beach. He told reporters it was the toughest piece of news he had ever received. He said they had been afraid of this for 7 years. He did not mention the bonds he had accumulated. He did not mention that he had already been planning to sell the land. On Sunday, the day after the fire, 350,000 people came to Coney Island. They came to see the ruins. Concessionaires set up booths along Surf Avenue and sold souvenirs, twisted metal, animal teeth, pieces of debris. Someone claimed to have the axe blade that killed Black Prince. Someone else sold St. Bernard puppies supposedly rescued from the flames. Samuel Gumpertz pitched a tent on the still smoldering ground and opened the Dreamland Circus sideshow. The show would continue for another 20 years. The dream was over. The carnival went on. Chapter 11. What Remained. 2 days after the fire, Reynolds made his move. He proposed selling the Dreamland site to New York City for conversion to a public park. The price he suggested was $3 million. When newspapers reported this figure, Reynolds denied it. He said the city could buy the entire 40-acre tract surrounding his property for that amount. The negotiations would drag on for nearly a decade. The Board of Estimate voted in July 1911 to acquire the land through condemnation. By October, they had agreed to pay $1 million for a 7-acre portion of the site. Legal disputes erupted almost immediately. The Morey and Lott families claimed ownership of nearly all of Coney Island based on a quitclaim deed granted by one Nicholas Johnson, who they said had agreed to sell land he had no right to sell. The city took title in March 1912. The Condemnation Commission announced an award of $2.189 million in late 1914. The city appealed. A second commission reduced the award to $1.4 million in 1919. The state Supreme Court confirmed the revised figure in June 1920. The proceedings had cost $800,000 in legal fees alone. Reynolds received his share. Combined with the insurance money and the bonds he had purchased at a discount, he turned his most spectacular failure into a modest profit. By then, Reynolds had already moved on. He had begun developing Long Beach on Long Island's southern barrier shore even before Dreamland burned. He bought nearly 3,500 acres for what some accounts say was only $100,000. He dredged a channel to accommodate yachts and steamboats. He built a fireproof hotel, a 50-foot-wide boardwalk, and thousands of homes in the Mediterranean style he mandated for the entire community. As a publicity stunt, he marched elephants from Coney Island to Long Beach to help build the boardwalk. In 1914, the village of Long Beach Estates elected its first mayor. It was William Reynolds. In 1922, when Long Beach became a city, he was elected its first mayor again. Reynolds also held a lease on land at 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. He hired architect William Van Allen to design an 808-foot skyscraper for the site. The plans were drawn. Then, in 1928, Reynolds sold the lease and the designs to Walter Chrysler for over $2 million. Chrysler adapted those plans into the iconic building that still bears his name. Had Reynolds built it himself, it would have been the tallest building in the world. But Reynolds had a pattern. He dreamed of monuments, built empires, and walked away before the final act. His luck did not hold forever. In 1924, Reynolds was indicted along with the Long Beach City Treasurer for stealing over $8,000 in public funds. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. The town responded by stopping the clock at City Hall in protest. Reynolds was released pending appeal, and the conviction was reversed the following year. The charges were eventually dropped. William Reynolds died of heart disease on October 13, 1931, at his Manhattan apartment. He was 63 years old. His estate was valued at over $10 million. Half went to his wife. His 2 daughters split the rest. Samuel Gumpertz outlasted them all. After the fire, he ran the Dreamland Circus sideshow from that tent on Surf Avenue for nearly 2 decades. He also served as president of the Coney Island Chamber of Commerce. In 1929, he left Brooklyn to become manager of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. 3 years later, when the circus board voted John Ringling out of control of his own company, Gumpertz was named vice president and general manager. The showman who had run Liilipuchia and recruited performers from around the world now controlled the greatest show on earth. He held the position until his death in 1952. The southern portion of the Dreamland site sat empty for years. The remaining structures were razed by 1915. In 1921, it became a parking lot. Proposals came and went. Finally, in 1941, the city decided to relocate the New York Aquarium from its original home at Castle Clinton in Manhattan. The aquarium opened on the Dreamland site in 1957. It stands there today. Where the beacon tower once rose 375 feet into the sky, visitors now watch sea lions and sharks. In 2009, divers recovered a 500-pound bronze bell from the Atlantic Ocean just off the old pier. According to the Coney Island History Project, it was the only major remnant of Dreamland ever found. The bell had hung at the end of the iron pier for 7 seasons. It had watched 1 million lights flicker on each evening at dusk. It had heard the roar of the crowd and the crash of water down the chutes. It had survived the fire only to sink beneath the waves and lie forgotten for nearly a century. Now it sits in a museum, silent witness to a dream that burned. Chapter 12. Legacy. Sigmund Freud visited Dreamland in 1909. He later remarked that the only thing about America that interested him was Coney Island. Perhaps for a man who spent his career probing the depths of the unconscious mind, Dreamland made a certain kind of sense. Here was a place where fantasy was made material, where the pleasure principle ruled, where 1 million lights blazed against the darkness, and towers rose like fever dreams from the Atlantic shore. Freud was not the only famous visitor to see something deeper in those electric towers. 3 years before Freud arrived, the Russian writer Maxim Gorky came to Coney Island in 1906. His friends took him there to cheer him up after a disappointing trip to New York. Gorky was not cheered. He wrote an essay about his experience, published in The Independent in August 1907. He called it Boredom. In it, he described the parks as a fantastic city, all of fire rising from the ocean into the sky, golden gossamer threads trembling in the air, fabulous and beyond conceiving. But the beauty disturbed him. Gorky saw the cheap facades, the mechanical pleasures, the masses of people wandering in what he called a slow dance of weary boredom. He compared the place to hell. And near the end of his essay, Gorky wrote that his soul was seized with a desire for a living, beautiful fire, a sublime fire that would burn away all this allurement, all this mad frenzy. 4 years later, his words proved prophetic. Dreamland's influence spread far beyond that peninsula off the Brooklyn shore. By 1905, the success of Coney Island had inspired amusement parks across the country. The timing was perfect. Workers in increasingly industrialized cities were searching for places to spend their new leisure time and disposable incomes. Electrically powered trolleys made cheap excursions possible. By 1919, more than 1,500 amusement parks were operating in America. Many of them borrowed the names of the Coney Island parks, especially Luna Park. Frederick Ingersoll of Pittsburgh opened his first Luna Park in 1905. He eventually built 44 of them around the world. It was the first chain of amusement parks. Luna Parks appeared from Japan to Australia, Egypt to Mexico. In Melbourne, a Luna Park opened in 1912 and still operates today. In Sydney, another opened in 1935 and remains a landmark on the harbour. The term Luna Park became a common noun. In Polish, French, Italian, Hebrew, and several other languages, it simply means amusement park. And then there was Disney. In August 1953, Walt Disney traveled to Coney Island. He was accompanied by actor Richard Todd, who was promoting a Disney film in New York. Todd later recalled that Disney called him up and said, "Come to Coney Island with me." They spent the day riding every ride, eating cotton candy, watching the crowds. Disney was researching. He wanted to see what people liked doing, but what he found disappointed him. In the decades since Dreamland burned, Coney Island had fallen into decline. By the early 1950s, the area was run down and shabby. Violence had replaced elegance. The crowds that once thrilled to creation and the canals of Venice now wandered past crumbling facades and tawdry sideshows. Disney told his wife that the trip nearly made him give up on the idea of an amusement park entirely. "The whole place is so run down and ugly," he said. "The people who run it are so unpleasant." But he did not give up. He took what he had learned at Coney Island and built something different. In 1955, Disneyland opened in Anaheim. According to Disney's own historians, his team had studied Luna Park's approach to structuring attractions around historical, cultural, and geographical themes. They took Coney Island's innovations and refined them, cleaned them up, made them safe for the suburbs. Scholars credit Walt Disney with single-handedly saving the American amusement park industry in the 1950s. He built his empire on the ashes of Dreamland's legacy. The original Luna Park at Coney Island burned to the ground in 1944. Steeplechase Park, the last of the great original parks, closed in 1964. The land was sold to developers. By the 1970s, Coney Island had become a symbol of urban decay, its grand past forgotten beneath graffiti and broken glass. But Coney Island refused to die. In 2010, a new Luna Park opened on Surf Avenue. It stands today within sight of where Dreamland once blazed. The Cyclone roller coaster, built in 1927, still rattles along its original wooden track. Nathan's Famous still serves hot dogs on the corner where the first one was sold in 1916. Every summer, 1 million people still come to the beach. And somewhere beneath the boardwalk, in the sand where the incubator babies once slept, and the lion named Black Prince met his end, and 1 million electric lights flickered on each evening at dusk. The memory of Dreamland endures. It endures in every theme park on Earth, in every roller coaster that climbs toward the sky, in every child who walks through gates that promise wonder. William Reynolds built a city of light on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. It stood for 7 seasons. Then it burned. But the dream never stopped burning.